before we can look at absolute value equations, we need to make sure that we understand the meaning of absolute value. The absolute value of a number represents the distance from 0 on the number line. So if you have a number line, and 0 is right here, if I'm looking at the absolute value of, for example, 4, that would mean I'm looking at 4 spaces from 0. So that could be in the positive direction, or I could be looking at 4 spaces from 0 in the negative direction. So the absolute value is looking at the distance from 0. So you have to consider the distance in the negative direction and the distance in the positive direction. The absolute value is written like this with the 2 long bars. So this reads the absolute value of x equals 4, which means that x could be negative 4, signifying 4 spaces from 0 in the negative direction. Or x could be positive 4, signifying the value of 4 spaces in the positive direction. Let's look at an example. So if I have the absolute value of x minus 5, and I say that that's equaling 13. So let's change up my number line here. 0 is here, 13 is here, negative 13 is here. So this means that I need to consider 13 spaces from 0 in the positive direction as a solution to x minus 5. But I also need to consider 13 spaces from 0 in the negative direction as a solution to x minus 5. So that means I need to look at this in 2 parts. I need to consider x minus 5 could be 13, resulting in a positive 13 spaces from 0. But I also need to consider that x minus 5 could be negative 13, resulting in negative 13 spaces from 0. So I have 2 equations that I need to solve in order to solve this absolute value equation. So solving this, we work through just like we did with any other linear equations. First thing we would do is add our 5 to both sides. If I add 5 to both sides, 13 plus 5 is going to give me 18. If I add 5 to both sides over here, negative 13 plus 5 is negative 8. So that means that in order for x minus 5 to equal 13 in the absolute value, it could be x is 18, which would give us the positive 13. Or it could be negative 8 minus 5 is negative 13, but when you take the absolute value of negative 13, you get 13. So x is either 18 or negative 8. Let's try some. Number 1. Absolute value of 7x plus 12 equals the absolute value of x minus 8. We have an absolute value on both sides in this case. So what that means is, if I had the 7x plus 12, I have to consider that it could be the negative of x minus 8. Or I have to consider that it could be the positive of x minus 8. So our 2 equations are going to look like 7x plus 12 equals x minus 8. That's the positive consideration. Or, let me switch it to green. 7x plus 12 equals negative x minus 8. 2 equations, because either one with the absolute value would make a true statement. So let's solve this one first, and then we'll solve over here. So if we want to simplify this one, we need to move all of our x's to the same side. I have 7 x's on this side already, so how about I just move this x over? So subtracting an x from both sides, that will give me 6x plus 12 equaling negative 8. I need the x by itself, so let's move this plus 12 by subtracting 12 from both sides. So 6x equals negative 20. Dividing by 6, negative 20 over 6, which we can simplify to negative 10 over 3. Then let's do the same thing over here, but before we can do that, we need to distribute our negative. So if we go to solve this down, we have 7x plus 12 equals negative x. And then we had a negative times a negative gives us a positive 8. We have 7x's over here, negative 1 over here, so let's move that one over. 7x plus x is going to give me 8x. Moving the 12 over, dividing both sides by 8. So that means in order to satisfy this absolute value inequality, x needs to be negative 10 thirds or x needs to be negative 1/2. Let's try again. So now we have the absolute value of 2x plus 3 equaling 19. That means that 2x plus 3 equals 19, or 2x plus 3 equals negative 19, because we have to consider both the positive and the negative correlation to the distance from 0. So if we subtract our 3 from both sides, then we can divide both sides by 2. Over here, if we subtract our 3 from both sides, so we subtracted our 3, now we can divide by 2. So that means that x is equal 8 or negative 11, and that will solve our equation, giving us the absolute value of 2x plus 3 is 19. Let's try again. Number 3. So I need to consider both sides again. So we'll have 14 minus 1/3 x equals 8, or 14 minus 1/3 x equals negative 8. And so let's solve this down. I'll move the 14 over first, which is going to give me negative 1/3 x. And 8 minus 14 is going to give us negative 6. Then I need to get rid of this negative 1/3, which means I need to multiply both sides by negative 3 over 1. This will cancel. A negative times a negative gives me a positive x. Negative times a negative gives me a positive. 6 times 3 is 18. Over here, same thing. I need to subtract the 14. If I subtract the 14 from both sides, I have negative 1/3 x, negative 22. Then I need to multiply by negative 3 over 1, multiply by negative 3 over 1. These will cancel. I'm left with positive x equals a negative times a negative gives me positive 66. So if x is 18 or 66, it will satisfy our absolute value equation. Let's try again. Number 4. Absolute value of 7x plus 4 equals 0. Think about this one for a second. When we drew that number line, was there any such thing as negative 0? Can you be 0 spaces from 0 in the negative direction? So there's no negative 0 to consider. So we have 7x plus 4 equals 0 as the only equation to solve. Subtracting our 4 from both sides, dividing by 7, we get x equals negative 7/4. Let's try again. Number 5. Absolute value of x plus 5 minus 2 equaling 12. Now before you start writing your two separate equations, notice that minus 2 right there. You have to get down to just the absolute value. Doesn't matter what else is around, you have to get it to just the absolute value before you consider the two parts. Because considering the two parts is considering the absolute value. So the first thing that we need to do here is add our 2 to both sides. So we'll be left with the absolute value of x plus 5 equaling 14. Now you can write your two separate equations. So we'll have x plus 5 equals 14 and x plus 5 equals negative 14. But we had to take care of this minus 2 first before we could consider our absolute value. So here we subtract our 5 from both sides. 14 minus 5 is 9. Here we subtract our 5 from both sides. Negative 14 minus 5 is negative 19. Let's look at number 6. we have the absolute value of 2x minus 4 plus 5 equaling 3. Same thing, we have this extra piece right here. We have to get rid of that before we can consider the positive side and the negative side. So we're left with the absolute value of 2x minus 4. I need to get rid of the addition of 5, so I need to subtract 5 from both sides. When I have 3 and I subtract 5, I get negative 2. Now before you start writing your two separate pieces, look at what this is saying. It is saying the absolute value of 2x minus 4 is equal to negative 2. You can't have a negative distance. You can be two spaces in the negative direction, but you cannot have a negative distance. So the absolute value can never be negative. So there's no solution, because no matter what I put in for this x, when I take the absolute value, it's going to be positive. Absolute value is a positive distance. It can be in the negative direction, but it cannot be negative. So there's no solution here. Let's try one more. We have the absolute value of 13x equals the absolute value of 2x plus 1. So this means that I have 13x equals 2x plus 1, or I'm going to put the negative on this side because then I don't have to distribute it. So negative 13x equals 2x plus 1. So now we solve both of these. Moving my 2x over, 13x minus 2x gives me 11x. Dividing both sides by 11. Over here, moving my 2x over, 13x minus 2x is negative 15x. Dividing both sides by negative 15. So that means that x is either 1 over 11 or negative 1 over 15.